And when we look at for both CPG and for retail, the shift that we're seeing really is moving more towards a consumer-centric focus as opposed to a product-centric focus. So if you look at consumers on the CPG side, the idea of even the younger generation around traceability of product. They want to know exactly where that came from. So how in a store to use augmented reality in the store. They're looking for food safety. So the changing expectations of the consumer and how the consumer is also kind of, from a social engineering perspective, from a social perspective, also controlling your brand, which was not the case 5 or 10 years ago, where you controlled your brand as a whole. So how is that shifting in the marketplace, and how, as a CPG company, can you get your arms around it? And then from a retail perspective, for our retailers in the room, focused on that omni-channel experience for the consumer. So you put the consumer at the center of the journey. It's all about, it's not get it right, it's all about get me right. And that's what the consumer is saying. Understand who I am. Let's drive some hyper-personalization at any point in the journey. So as a company, you have to look at all the facets of the journey, both from an online perspective and then both in-store and watching those digital divides come together. So you have to look at your mindset across this entire channel, and that goes both for CPGs and retails as a whole. And I think on this one, this is, it's like a day in the life. As you look at your products from a CPG perspective, what's selling, or retailer, what's selling, what's not, and then making gut decisions to do X, do Y, do Z, that actually has some major impact to you down the road. And in essence, the idea is if you look at your data, you bring in all these different resources outside, all these third-party resources of data, and stitch it all together, how does that help you look around the corner? And so, the time between big computes, between the data and AI, and all of this coming together today, we're at a very inflection point. When you look at the past, humans, we basically had to adapt to technology, and now it's kind of flipped, and now technology is adapting to humans. And it's an amazing kind of subset where we're at, and kind of an inflection point. And it's great to have Prevedere here to talk about what they're doing around this space.
In talking with especially leaders within companies, the C-suite and marketing leads, finance leads, really the biggest risk to success for companies is really the external environment. And the macro environment is a big part of that, because you may do great pricing, great promotion, but if consumers aren't feeling like they're making more money, they're not going to buy your products and services. So as an IT leader, as I mentioned, in a large company, business intelligence I thought was a great tool for our leaders within the company to use. But I realized, and I saw happen, as we went from transactional systems, and ERP was big, to data warehouse, which would consolidate data, to business intelligence, which would report on that internal data. However, decision makers rarely looked at it. CEOs, CFOs probably never. We may have had it right on their desktop, but it wasn't something they were looked at. So I just asked the question of our finance lead, our CFO, and said, what are we missing? What data or information can we put in those BI reports that you'll use and consume and you'll make decisions with? And what he said back in 2011 led to the development of Prevedere, which was kind of an epiphany for me. He said, all that internal historical data, it's static and it's happened before. We can't change it or do anything about it, right? So we don't want to look at that as a leader within the organization. We want to see external leading drivers for now what we build a very diverse, large global company. And with that, I said, well, what are you talking about? I said, well, we make products that go into different end-use markets, different consumers, for example, but also we're in every geography around the world. And I want to look for leading drivers so that I can make smarter future and forward-looking decisions. And to me, I took that to heart and said, I think we can do that. We can grab external data. We can watch consumer behavior. We can bring in weather data. And we can give you more facts and information about the future of the business and not focus so much just on the static, backward-looking charts and graphs in our BI tool. So for me, the evolution was going from internal and historical to external and predictive plus internal. Right, so it's a holistic picture. And there's lots of examples we can show you, but this is something you would think doesn't change much over time. It should be very easy to predict. Well, what we found actually, the category does change over time quite a bit and significantly. And small movements in this mean profitability or not profitability for a very large, multi-billion-dollar company. So what they asked us to do is say, first, let's look at the category. And we're a partner with Nielsen, so we have great category and syndicated data on bath tissue. So what we did is took 5 years of historical sales. we looked at the US and really the channel was retail and said, well, what if we could find leading signals and clues that would tell us about changes in demand for bath tissue? Where do we get this data? What type of stuff? Well, there's lots of sources. Matter of fact, we collect over 2.5 million data series every day from hundreds of sources, maybe even thousands by now, but it's online data, IoT, trusted partners. I mentioned Nielsen. We have the largest bank in Asia that gives us debit card transactions by categories. We have the traditional economic factors, online behavior, Google, our partner at Microsoft, Bing, and Bing Search that can help us with the customer journey. All that data is available to us. And what we find is, we'll find signals like these, real average hourly earnings and average hourly earnings of weekly retail employees or weekly hours of retail employees, average hourly paper products industry. So specific things for that industry, how workers are really either ramping up or declining will give us clues and signals about the future. The other thing is we took metrics around supply and demand of that specific product. We can see the cost of paper. That's going to be important, right? But also inventories and capacity out there. That'll tell us whether they're going to ship more or there's enough that we're going to be able to cover these swings in demand. And then macroeconomic factors and IoT data here with cash freight shipments. So we'll watch rail cars. They have sensors on it. They'll tell us what's being shipped and where. We'll look at consumer sentiment and purchase intent, which is extremely important, but we'll get very specific in one of our providers and ask about brands and stores and where they shop and what they're going to spend in 6 months or 9 months. We'll look at overall FX rates. That has an impact as well. And what we see, if you look at raw data, and this is something I learned from a chief economist and a leading retail analyst at Goldman Sachs, if you look at data as it happens, it's very noisy. So you can see there are seasonality to paper products and bath tissue.
Which is in blue.
Which is in blue, right? And you can see that we found leading indicators in things like industrial production of paper products, but just looking at it as it happens, you can't tell what's leading what. So what our engine does is it has multiple frequencies and calculations and statistical lead and lag time that happens and pattern matching. And we're able to see these different changes. That we'll see a leading indicator like industrial products here in production of paper is a leading indicator for changes 12 months later in bath tissue sales. And actually our system does what's on this next screen a little bit more is it takes those peaks and valleys. It'll allow us to align those. And what you see are these leading indicators. If you look at them correctly, you'll find those patterns that I learned from those economists. The actual lead time can be 2, 3, 9 months for average weekly hours of all employees in retail. We'll see some that are 12, 18 months out. You can see these patterns, but also we can see the statistical correlation and pattern matching in here. So our engine does that in just minutes, thanks to the power of MapReduce on Azure Cloud Computing and a cognitive engine that we built. We find dozens of leading indicators, and then we test and learn. We take the combination, it makes sense based on supply and demand and geography, macroeconomic factors, industry data, and we build these predictive models. So it's an automated thing that happens. Your data scientists don't have to know where all that data lives and know to go test employment data for bath products or weekly retail hours is going to matter and other factors that maybe they just don't even know about. The predictive model here is this dashed line. The solid line is what actually happened. This future performance will go out as far as leading indicators. If you're like we were as a company and like most companies we deal with, your people that are planning and forecasting may give you a few periods and this kind of a straight line, either up or down or flat typically. Whereas when you actually take leading indicators, you can truly get very predictive. Several months in advance, even 18 months or further, depending on what industry you're in and what product categories. We found that this actually is plus or minus just 3%. So we can forecast this plus or minus 3% in a rolling forecast that updates every day.